So I was thinking about this the other day. My builds really tend to run the gamut from extremely well thought out to basically just improvised. But lately I've been doing a lot of planning. So for today's video, I would like to go the complete opposite direction. Today, I would like to build a custom hammock with absolutely no planning and no preparation. That's right, today's video is all about how to build something when you have no idea what you're doing. Because I think we've all been in that situation before. You know what? Technically, I guess I kind of lied. I did do this little window sketch here in preparation for this build. Let me finish it real quick. Yeah, I'm not great at drawing. You definitely don't want me on your Pictionary team. So, as you can see, I know the general shape of what I want to build, but really, that's not much. Oh, and actually, I do know one other piece of the puzzle because today's video is sponsored by Krylon, makers of high-quality, aerosolized paints and finishes since 1947. There's definitely gonna be some metal work in this build, and whenever I have metal that needs to be treated for either interior or exterior uses, I always turn to Krylon. But we'll talk more about the specific Krylon products that I chose for this build once we actually get to using them. For now, I think that's enough blabbing from me. You guys watch the intro, and I'm gonna head to the shop. Now that we're here in the shop, we can get started on this build, but I really have to say, I am starting to get pretty overwhelmed by just how many different things there are that I'm gonna have to figure out over the course of this build. And honestly, I think that's a perfectly normal feeling anytime you're stepping outside your comfort zone. But one thing that I have found that really helps with that feeling is breaking a build down into more manageable components. Instead of thinking about the entirety of the build and all the little details that I'm gonna have to sort out, I'm just gonna focus on one piece of the project at a time. Conceptually, in my head, this hammock stand is comprised of three main components. You have two sets of legs at either end, and then you have a steel mesh that joins them together. So I think I'm not gonna worry so much about how everything is gonna tie together. I'm just gonna focus on building the legs first, and then I'll sort out the details later. For the legs, I have chosen to use Ipe. And if you've never heard of Ipe before, it is an extremely hard and extremely dense wood, great for exterior use. And it's also extremely expensive. I spent 120 bucks on just two pieces of this stuff. So I better be careful with it. Two quick notes about cutting Ipe. One, Ipe dust is extremely toxic, so make sure you've got on some good lung protection while you're cutting it. And two, part of the reason that Ipe is so strong is because it absorbs silica, aka sand. The same silica is what makes it so toxic, and it's extremely hard on saw blades. So if you've got a lot of Ipe to cut, consider using some old saw blades that you don't care about. So now I have to figure out how wide I want to make my A-frame legs, and my thinking here is just to spread them out until they're approximately the same width as the hammock itself. And now, in order to figure out what this interior angle is, I'm just gonna push in this digital angle gauge, and that reads 118 degrees. To keep things nice and simple, I rounded that up to 120 degrees and then cut 60-degree miters onto the ends of each of my legs. Look at that, that is just perfect. So now we're gonna switch gears and do a little bit of metal fab. I'm gonna create a steel bracket that sits on top of these frames and holds this joint together because this is gonna be under so much tension that wood glue is not gonna cut it. To start, I cut some 12-inch lengths of 3/16 plate steel on the cold cut saw. Then outside, using the cordless angle grinder, I freehand cut that same 60-degree miter as the legs. And because freehand cutting is not the most precise thing in the world, I cleaned up all of my cuts on the belt sander. I also beveled all the cuts on the belt sander too, because I was about to weld all of those seams together, and the beveled edges allow the bead of the weld to penetrate deeper into the steel, creating a stronger weld. And because I'm a big fan of overkill, I made sure to weld both sides of the seam. Back outside, I quickly ground down my welds and then clamped all 4 V's together and rounded off their pointed tips. By doing them all at the same time like this, I ensured that they all had the same radius. In order to mount the plates to the legs, I planned to through bolt them. This meant that I had to drill some holes into each of my plates over on the drill press. Quick tip, a little bit of cutting oil will help to keep your drill bits from going dull on you while you're drilling through steel. Finally, I had one last thing to do on these plates. I had to add a hook that I could then hang the hammock on. Lucky for me, I had some eye bolts kicking around that, with a little bit of modification, would suit my needs quite nicely.
I then welded it into place and really laid down a thick welding bead the whole way around it. That way I had plenty of material to smooth out later. Oh, and before I could bolt everything together, I had to drill some holes in the legs. In order to make sure that I didn't mess anything up, instead of measuring where each bolt hole went individually, I just used the plates themselves as a guide. After drilling the holes, I did a quick test fit of the bolts and reached my first major roadblock on this build.
When I bought these bolts, they came in two lengths, 2 inches and 2.5 inches. I knew 2.5 inches was gonna be way too long and there'd be too much thread sticking out the other side. I was kind of hoping I could get away with just 2 inches, but there's not quite enough thread poking through to accommodate both these plates and give me something positive to connect the nuts to. So what I'm gonna have to do is mortise out the top of these pieces. And I'm gonna do that using a little trick I've learned with a router.
The traditional way to do this would be with a hammer and chisel. But I'm not really a traditional guy. Instead, I loaded a 1/2 inch cutting head into my trim router, set its depth to match the thickness of the plate, and then slowly and carefully walked it across each leg, one cutting head width at a time. This was dusty and time consuming, but it did give me a perfect mortise with very little need for hand-eye coordination.
So this now sits in there nice and flush. We have plenty of threads on the underside to attach our nuts to. And now, I think I'm gonna go ahead and mortar this side in as well.
After doing the first one and seeing just how much of a mess it made, I did the other 3 out back behind the shop. After a bit of sweeping, I brought the legs back inside and fully bolted them together for the very first time.
Can stand this up. Now we have to figure out the angles of the feet. This angle here is actually relatively easy to figure out since I made the angles at the top 60 degrees. If I wanted to sit flat on the ground, I had to make this 30. But I also want these frames to lean back at an angle. So this bottom cut is gonna be a bit more complex. I'm gonna add a second 30-degree miter because, well, 30 and 30, it just seems right, to that cut. So it's actually gonna be a compound miter cut.
By angling the base and tilting the head of the saw, I was able to do a compound cut on the end of each leg. These are a little tricky because all of a sudden you have to start thinking in 3 dimensions instead of just the normal 2. I think anybody who's ever tried to install crown molding knows exactly what I'm talking about.
A little bit of bolting later and we are ready to stand this thing up for the first time. See how we did. Yeah, that looks very nice. Now that the legs are done, we can start thinking about how we're gonna tie the 2 sets of legs together.
And in order to do that, I had to clear out a little bit of floor space in the shop and set up a whole new workstation.
This is a pretty rough approximation of how I want the webbing that's gonna connect the 2 frames to look. Obviously, you'll have to use your imagination a little bit. This line will continue out that way, and then on the other side, you'll have a mirror of the exact same thing. Now, there's a lot of really complex angles here, and I don't think I have the brain power necessary to math them out. So what I'm actually gonna do is feel them out. And in order to make this a little easier for myself, I'm gonna use a strategy that I use a lot, which is using proxies. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use an easier to work with medium to figure out all my lengths and angles, and then I'm going to take those measurements and transfer them to my harder to work with medium, which in this case is steel.
By using wood instead of steel to trial and error my way through this problem, I was able to save a lot of cutting time. I'd cut a piece, check to see how it fit, and then make any adjustments I needed to from there. Eventually, after enough back and forth, I'd find something that fit nicely and take note of the angle. I even got to do some more fun compound cuts where the 2 pieces intersected.
Look at that. That is pretty damn good. So now I think the thing to do is take all of these measurements, transfer them to our steel, and see if we can fab up the shape in steel.
One angle at a time, I transferred everything that I learned from my wood proxies over onto some thick-walled 1x3 steel tube. Since this frame is going to be under a decent amount of stress, I gladly paid a little bit extra for the heavier gauge steel. Now unfortunately, my steel saw won't do compound cuts, so when it came time to actually cut all these Sharpie lines, I was back to freehanding everything with my cordless angle grinder. Next, I set up back on the welding table and started tacking together these V-shaped pieces. The longer seams I'm doing here took a little while to do, but they offered me a really good chance to practice my welding technique. After a few minutes, I had a single solid piece that was ready for a test fit.
Now I've got to fabricate a little steel bracket so that we can through bolt this just like we did up at the top.
Following the same 30-degree angles as the legs, I cut some 5-inch long pieces of flat bar steel and drilled 2 bolt holes in each piece. When I went to weld the plates to my metal V's, instead of setting everything up on the welding table, I took the tool to the job and welded everything together in place. That way I didn't have to worry about precisely measuring and locating all the different pieces. I just put them where they were going to go and tacked everything together. I then set up and did the other side, all while blissfully unaware of the mistake I had just made. Oh crap.
Yesterday, I basically ended up rage quitting on this build. I realized halfway through welding on those brackets that the bracket design that I came up with isn't gonna work. See this lowest bolt hole here? Because it's at an angle and because it's so close to the floor, by the time you get a bolt through it and then through the epay and out to the other side, it'll essentially be touching the floor, which will make it impossible to get a nut on it, which means the only functional bolt hole is gonna be this one up at the top, which frankly, I don't think is enough by itself to support the entire weight of this frame. And honestly, I think there's a bigger lesson here about remaining flexible, because if you're gonna try to build something like this without a set of plans, you are going to run into small issues. So you have to be able to adapt and you have to be able to pivot your design on the fly. And you also have to allow yourself the ability to walk away from something if you find you're getting frustrated.
And that's exactly what I did. After going home and sleeping on the problem, I came up with the solution of turning my mounting plate into a mounting shoe. I cut a bunch more 5-inch long pieces of plate steel and started welding them around the legs. With a full wrap like this, I felt confident that a single bolt at the top of the shoe would be strong enough to tie everything together. And all of those lower bolt holes that I drilled earlier could simply be filled in and painted over. With the mounting solution finally fixed, it was time to cut the stretcher that would connect the two sets of legs together. However, after I did, I was confronted by yet another unforeseen issue.
Looks like we've got a little bit of a problem here. This flat end will not fit onto here in order to make that connection. Solution to that is called a bird's mouth. And if you've never heard of a bird's mouth before, it's a pretty simple concept. Basically, I just cut the profile of this into a flat piece so that it slots over like this. I cut this off camera on a piece of scrap, and then we'll just transcribe it over onto the stretcher piece.
This is actually a technique that I first learned while framing houses. You'll often use bird's mouths to help attach roof rafters to walls and ridge beam. But hey, as it turns out, it also works pretty well when you're making a hammock frame out of steel too. One of the things that I love about building so much is that you can often take these lessons learned in one field and then seamlessly transfer them into a completely different area. It's a lot of fun.
That's a better fit.
Again, I got a great opportunity to practice my welding here, and I also got a chance to practice bridging some larger gaps as well. My bird's mouths were close, but there were still some small gaps that required a bit of attention. Part of what I love about welding so much is that you're adding material, so if you find yourself in a situation where your cuts don't quite line up, you can always just fudge it with the bead of the weld and then grind it all smooth afterwards. Which I was almost ready to do, but I wanted to test something first.
Look at how stiff this frame is. The fact that I can just roll this over from a single point shows you just how sturdy it is. Now, let's unwrap and test out this hammock. I didn't make this hammock, as you can clearly see. It's coming out of a cardboard box. Figured I have my hands full building the actual frame, so I outsourced this part of the build. Now, I believe this hammock is actually roughly the size of a queen-size bed, so should be good for 2 people, assuming that my frame can support it. One concern that I had about this hammock, and actually this frame in general too, is that it will probably sag a little bit over time. As the fabric and these ropes stretch out, they're bound to expand a little bit. So what I did was I made sure that I picked a hammock that had easy to tie knots. So worst case scenario, say this sags a couple inches over the years, all I have to do is undo these knots, pull a little bit of slack out of them, retie them. Sure, it might take me 20 minutes or so to do the whole side, but at least that way I know that I can always adjust it in the future and make sure I still get the perfect fit. Now that we're done testing the hammock, let's spend a little bit of time cleaning up these welds, and I'm gonna show you a new toy I got. This is DeWalt's DCG 426 cordless die grinder. And I think the easiest way to explain what this tool is that it's just a super overpowered Dremel. When combined with this carbide head here, it should be really good at grinding away at steel. So my hope is that I can use this to do the heavy lifting when it comes to cleaning up my welds, and then I'll switch back to my normal flat paddle method for really smoothing them out. Let's go see how it works.
Right away, one thing that I realized is that this tool is very powerful and cuts quickly. So if you aren't careful, you can end up gouging your steel and removing more than you bargained for. That being said, once I got the hang of it, I really liked it. Because of the profile of the head, you can easily reach inside corners and other hard to reach places. It's got some lights that illuminate your work area, and it's got a variable speed trigger, which I'm always a fan of.
I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with this thing. I wouldn't use it for finish work, it's pretty rough, but it is great for getting the worst of it. And now I'll just go back to my traditional method, which is using the flat paddle disc to clean all of these up.
While I don't think the die grinder is going to fully replace my angle grinder, it should help to speed things up. And, importantly, it should also help to curb my flat disc budget. By doing the heavy lifting with the longer lasting carbide head, I can buy less flat discs and save some money. Anyways, this part of the build was pretty straightforward. I smoothed out all of my corners and joints and then gave the entire metal frame a good thorough sanding to further polish the metal and prep it for paint. And while I had the sander out, I figured that I should do the Ipe legs as well. I also subtly rounded all the corners with a block sander to make them a little bit softer to the touch.
Oh man, okay, so that was a lot of work. Keep in mind that prepping this whole thing for paint, all that grinding and sanding, that was a day and a half of work. So like I said, we're almost ready for the paint, but there's two things I want to do first. The first of which is just bolt this whole thing together as a quick sanity check, make sure everything still fits, nothing's moved, and all of my measurements are still good.
When you're working on the fly like this, I find that it's always a good idea to dry fit things and check your work as often as possible. If something is slightly out of alignment, you definitely want to catch it as early as you can. The other thing I wanted to do was drill some holes for the bolts. The holes in the front of the shoes were already there from before, but I still needed to drill through the Ipe and out the backside of the shoes. This was a little tricky because I had no way to get oil in there to cool the bit, and as a result, I really risked burning out my only half-inch drill bit. But I took it nice and slow, and after many breaks to cool down the bit, I eventually got it done. Then, it was time to paint.
Let's talk about finishing. I think first off, we're gonna do the metal because the metal is getting finished with a product from the sponsor of today's video, Krylon. Today, I'm going to be using their Color Max paint in satin black. You can kind of think of it as like halfway between a flat and halfway between a gloss paint. You still have some of that hiding potential of a flat paint, but you also get the ability to easily clean the surface, just wipe it down, it's nice and smooth of a glossy finish. A couple other things about this paint. One, it's rated for outdoor use, which is perfect because this is going to live outside all year round, so I'm very happy about that. And the other thing is that this is a paint and primer in one. So just like I showed in my last video, you don't need to use a primer before applying this, which is really handy because it saves on material and labor costs when you're doing a job. Now, normally I like to do all of my finishing work here inside the shop, but today we have an abnormally beautiful day outside. It's not too humid, it's not too hot, so I'm gonna take all of this stuff, transfer it to an outdoor workstation and do all the painting out there. Oh, and one last thing before I move out there, this is the Canadian can of Krylon. I know a lot of you guys are in the US, so if you go to the store looking for a similar can, it's gonna look a little something like this. Sound good? All right, let's get outside and do some painting.
Painting outside isn't always the best idea. If it's too hot, too cold, or even too humid, it can negatively affect your finish. But if you check the side of your Krylon can, it will always tell you what the safe application temperature and humidity ranges are. Lucky for me, this day was right in that perfect weather pocket. Now, for anybody skeptical about applying paint right to the bare metal, don't worry, I don't blame you. I was pretty skeptical too, but you might want to check out my last video where I go a little bit more in depth on the topic. Long story short though, I am now a convert to paint and primers in one. They save a lot of time. And speaking of time, I sprayed on 3 coats of paint with 20 minutes between each coat. After applying the 3rd coat, I left the frame to dry in the shade and headed back inside the shop.
All right, while we wait for the spray paint to dry, let's talk about how we're gonna finish the Ipe. You guys may remember from my outdoor chair video that I used this Australian timber oil to finish those chairs, and I have some left over. I really liked how it worked there, so I figured this would be the perfect finish to apply to our Ipe back here.
I think I might actually like how this oil looks better on the Ipe, which is saying a lot because I really liked how it looked on those Hemlock chairs. Not only does this oil give the wood a deeper, richer look, but it should also help to protect it long term. Ipe has a tendency to silver over time if you leave it untreated. Some people like that look, but personally, I'm not a huge fan.
Oh, look at how good this looks. I love this color. Okay, so we're gonna let all of this dry, and then I'm going to take it home and start the reassembly process. I will meet you guys back at my place.
One last thing I did once I got the hammock home was add some felt pads to the bottom of the Ipe legs. These pads should prevent the legs from wicking up any moisture off the ground when it rains. After that, it was time to roll out the hammock and actually enjoy it for the first time.
man, that is it for another build. And this was an interesting one. I'll be honest, there were quite a few points throughout this build where I wish that I had done more planning, because it's almost always better to pre-plan your builds, but planning takes time, and time is a luxury that we often don't have. So I hope you found some of the tips and techniques that I offered to be useful the next time you find yourself in a situation where you had to build something without proper plan. It's not the ideal situation to find yourself in, but unfortunately, I think it is a pretty common one. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support this channel, the absolute best thing you can do is like, comment, or subscribe, or failing that, you can click any of the links in the video description below. All of them help the channel in some way. Big thank you to Krylon for sponsoring this build, and an especially big thank you to all my Patreon supporters. You guys rock. All right, I think that's it, and I will see you in the next video. But not before I take a nap in my new hammock. Peace.